She stepped into the first-class cabin, holding a ticket with no name, no airline logo, and not a single mark to suggest she was the most powerful person on this plane. The stewardess's gaze, sharp as a razor blade, the captain's clipped, cold words, and the smirk from a middle-aged man, they all said the same thing. You don't belong here. But just 5 minutes later, when a video clip exploded across the internet, the world, and everyone in that cabin learned the truth. The woman they had tried to humiliate wasn't just another passenger. She was Maya Johnson, the CEO of the very corporation that owned the plane. And the moment they ordered her off was the moment they ignited the biggest earthquake the modern aviation industry had ever seen. The noise in first class dropped to a chilling silence as a cold voice cut through the air. Ma'am, please step back. This area is not for someone like you. Captain Sarah Miller didn't need to raise her voice. Her tone alone was enough to slice the air like steel, a weaponized show of power that erased any unwanted presence. No apology, no hesitation. Just a sharp flick of her hand, like brushing dirt off the velvet carpet of the elite. If you can't prove priority boarding, you'll need to return to economy. A few passengers glanced up, eyes uncertain. No one knew whether to speak up or stay silent. Richard White, a white man in his 50s, hair slicked back, silver watch gleaming, took a step forward and placed his luggage in front of Maya like a barrier. His voice oozed disdain. This area isn't open to just anyone who feels like walking in. What they didn't know was that the woman they had just dismissed was Dr. Maya Johnson, CEO of the conglomerate that owned the aircraft, quietly preparing to upend the system in the next 5 fateful minutes. Maya entered the cabin with quiet composure. A petite black woman dressed in a wrinkled button-up, faded navy pants and plain slip-ons with no label. In her hand, a ticket so plain no one would ever believe it belonged to the head of a billion-dollar empire. But she didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the front row window seat, the one drawing every eye in the room. From the cockpit, Sarah Miller emerged. Blonde hair pinned high, uniform crisp, without a wrinkle, stride firm, chin lifted like a silent declaration of superiority. No polite smile, no greeting. Sarah sized Maya up like she was examining a defective product. The loose button, uneven pant cuff, the scratch on her rolling suitcase. This area is not for someone like you, she repeated. The cabin fell deathly still. A middle-aged couple stopped flipping through their magazines. 2 young men texting glanced up, brows furrowed. No one said a word, but the discomfort was written all over their faces. Sarah extended her hand coldly. Ticket, please. If you don't have priority confirmation, you'll need to move to economy. Maya said nothing. She simply handed over her ticket. Sarah took it between 2 fingers as if afraid to touch it, glanced at it, and tossed it back without a shred of courtesy. Her lips tightened as she hissed, "Unverify." Each word landed like a blade in the silence. Not a reply, a verdict, a cold rejection, wrapped in prejudice, authority, and the pride of a world trained to discard those who don't fit in. Richard White, smooth gray suit, glinting silver watch, didn't bother hiding his contempt. He shoved Maya's suitcase to the side like swatting away an uninvited guest, then casually claimed the overhead bin above her. Leaning toward Maya, his voice carried just enough for the whole cabin to hear, "This section needs to stay orderly." Not order. Erasure. It was his way of saying, "You don't exist here." Behind them, a few passengers exchanged smirks. Flight attendant Emma, standing nearby, offered a subtle sneer, a silent nod of agreement, as if with just glances, whispers, and tiny gestures, they could build a wall. And that wall closed in on Maya from every direction the moment she dared to step into this world of exclusivity. In the eye of dozens of stares, Maya took a deep breath. Her hands gripped the suitcase handle until her knuckles turned white. Then she lifted her head, eyes locking onto Sarah Miller's, steady, unwavering, unflinching. The 5-minute battle was about to begin, under the harsh golden light of privilege and the shadowy hands of prejudice. Sarah remained ice cold. no emotion. She flipped through the passenger manifest on her tablet, never once looking up. But her voice rang out, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. If you can't show confirmation of priority status, please move to economy. We only serve verified passengers here. It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. A decision made long before Maya ever had the chance to speak. The air inside the cabin grew thick, like everyone was holding their breath. Those who'd been focused on their phones or laptops froze. They turned, eyes now fixed on Maya, some curious, some indifferent, some gleeful, like they were watching an unscripted drama unfold for free. And Maya, she felt every stare. A black woman, simply dressed, hair neatly tied back, no designer purse, no luxury watch. Just a lone figure among tailored suits, crocodile leather bags, and expensive perfume. To her left, a middle-aged woman clutched her handbag tightly, eyes guarded. Behind her, a young man with thick glasses shook his head slightly at his girlfriend, whispering something Maya didn't care to decipher. And Richard White, the silent authority in the room, leaned back in his seat, tapping his fingers on the tray table like he was savoring a performance staged just for him. The faint smile on his lips belonged to someone convinced he'd already won, simply because the person standing before him didn't look the part. He didn't let the moment pass. Leaning toward the man beside him, Richard spoke loud enough for Maya to hear every word. Lately, Zenith's been letting in way too many underqualified passengers. Keep this up, and they're going to lose all sense of class. He didn't need to emphasize it. He didn't need to explain. His words floated through the air like a dagger aimed straight at Maya's dignity. But she didn't flinch. As if following a well-rehearsed script, Sarah Miller stepped forward again. Her eyes were ice, boring into Maya like she could erase her existence with a stare. "This is my final warning," Sarah said, her voice no longer just commanding. It was a sharp, veiled threat. "Prove your priority status, or security will escort you to economy. I'm simply following protocol." But her words weren't just for Maya. They were a silent signal to everyone else. Don't interfere. Don't even think about speaking up. And just like that, the cabin collectively looked away. Eyes dropped to phones, pages flipped in books, heads turned toward the window. Anything to avoid meeting Maya's gaze. She stood alone, in front of a wall built from silence and prejudice, colder, more brutal than any punishment. At the very back of the cabin, one person didn't look away. Ethan Collins, a well-known Asian American travel blogger, quietly pulled out his phone. He didn't rush. He simply observed. He took in the smugness on Richard's face, the unwavering stare from Sarah, and how the flight attendants avoided Maya like she was a problem to be contained, not a person to be acknowledged. Ethan knew sometimes small moments in confined spaces could reflect an entire history of injustice outside. He opened his camera, steady hands lifting his phone, as if capturing the truth before it had a chance to disappear. And then his lens settled on Maya's face. There was no fear, no confusion, only a quiet calm, laced with defiance that didn't need to speak. It was the look of someone who had lived with discrimination her whole life, and had decided she would never bow again. The cabin remained still, but beneath the hum of air conditioning ran an invisible current. Judgmental glances, tight-lipped head shakes, smug smirks that silently applauded injustice. Each movement tightened the invisible rope around Maya. No words needed. Society knows how to strangle someone's presence when they don't fit the mold. And in the center of that silent circle, Maya held her ground. Her fingers lightly grazed the suitcase handle, a familiar gesture to steady herself. Her eyes never left Sarah's. She didn't step back. Even as the entire cabin silently plotted to push her out, she stood like a still flame, a quiet presence whispering to herself, "Just stand still. The truth will speak for itself," because sometimes just refusing to bow is enough to shake the whole world. Surrounded by wary glances and quiet contempt, Maya didn't lower her head. She placed her suitcase neatly at her feet and calmly pulled out the boarding pass. A thin piece of paper, no gold trim, no embossed ink, nothing like the polished first-class tickets people were used to, but it held the weight of a plan that only she and a small team at Zenith headquarters knew. Maya had personally overseen the creation of these special tickets. No priority tag, no fast system scan. The goal? To see exactly how the system would treat someone who didn't look the part, not to expose individuals, but to measure the true soul of an industry that prided itself on luxury, yet often fell short on fairness. She held out the ticket, her hand steady, as if she were holding her own dignity in her palm. Sarah took it with 2 fingers, her face twisted in disgust. No scan, no system check, just a glance, and then she dropped it back into Maya's hand like it was something filthy. "Unverified," Sarah said, each word hammered like a nail into the cabin floor. "You're not in the system. I'm asking you to leave this cabin immediately. If you don't comply, I will call security." No one objected, no one even breathed too loudly. The cabin felt frozen. A few passengers pressed their lips together in satisfaction. They believed order had been restored, that the purity of first class had returned. Across from them, Richard White savored every second, like watching a delicious drama unfold. He looked at Maya with the smug curiosity of someone used to seeing others humiliated. Tapping his silver watch, he whispered to the man beside him, "At this rate, Zenith won't be able to tell who's VIP anymore." Sarah's eyes never left Maya, like the very sight of her was an offense. Her voice was cold steel. "We cannot allow an unverified individual to sit here. If you don't move now, I'll request security intervention." But just as Sarah continued delivering her verdict, a quiet tap echoed from the back of the cabin. Ethan Collins, the one who didn't look away, who didn't stay silent, hit record. His phone camera captured Maya, standing alone, face to face with a system frozen in bias. He opened his notes app, fingers gliding fast, deliberate. Each line sliced through the airline's polished image like a blade. Zenith flight crew tags black female passenger as non-priority. No verification, no check, just threats of removal. This is 2025 and it's still happening, ChatGPT said. Less than a minute later, that tweet lit up the timelines of thousands, and with a single tap, one man had invited the world to witness the truth. But in that moment, only one person remained unaware that she was about to become a symbol, not of luxury or class, but of something far greater than a first-class seat. Maya stood firm, like a tree rooted in the desert, silent, unshaken, and utterly immovable. On the other side of the digital world, a storm was beginning to stir. Richard White leaned back into his seat, enjoying the scene like a private performance crafted just for him. He tapped his tray table, a satisfied grin curling across his face, then leaned toward the man beside him, loud enough for Maya to hear every word. "First class is going downhill," he muttered. "If Zenith keeps lowering the bar like this, their reputation's going to be dust." His words weren't casual, they were aimed. Not just a dismissal, but a quiet act of exclusion disguised as idle conversation. But inside was the same old poison, prejudice wrapped in entitlement, delivered with the ease of someone who thought the world existed for him. Sarah stepped in again, so close now her breath could almost touch Maya. Her voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. It was ice. "This is your final warning. If you can't prove you're a priority passenger, I'll report you for non-compliance and request security. These are the rules. I'm just doing my job." But the words weren't only for Maya. They were a message to the entire cabin. Don't even think about standing with her. And they got the message. No one said a word. Some lowered their eyes, others feigned interest in their phones. The rest simply turned away, as if Maya had never existed at all. She stood alone, left behind a wall not made of steel or glass, but of fear and complicity. At the back of the cabin, Ethan Collins never looked away. Again he raised his camera. His lens caught Maya, still standing like a stone against the storm of bias. Then, silently, he typed his second caption, this time under a photo of Sarah standing in front of Maya. No ID check. Just blatant bias. A woman denied first-class entry moments before takeoff. Justice, where are you? Less than a minute later, Ethan's phone began to buzz nonstop. Hundreds of retweets, comments pouring in. Hashtags like Justice for Maya, Zenith discriminates, Who counts as Zip, flooded the feed. Black community leaders, feminist advocates, digital news outlets, they all joined in. Meanwhile, Sarah had no idea her every gesture was being watched, captured, and about to be broadcast to millions. She whispered to her crew in coded airline jargon, the kind of insider lingo only employees would understand. Then she turned back to Maya, this time with a voice low and final, like a verdict being read. This is your last notice. Leave this area now or I'll file a formal incident report. Every word, incident report, was carefully stressed, not just to threaten Maya, but to reinforce her authority in front of the silent crowd. The message was clear: fall out of line and you'll be erased. Richard kept playing his part. He raised his phone, pretending to type, but he was snapping photos of Maya, not for evidence, not for justice, for a private group chat where discrimination masqueraded as humor, where excluding others was a sport for those of us who stood at the top. Emma Walsh, the lead flight attendant, stood nearby, not speaking, not moving, simply nodding in agreement with Sarah. She tapped on her tablet. Non-compliant passenger refusing to move. No note about verifying the ticket. No mention of checking ID. Just a judgment made and a system quietly proving it was broken from the inside out. And in that moment, Maya still hadn't moved, but the world was already moving around her. They require security intervention. That cold phrase was logged into the system. No identity check, no badge scan, no confirmation. Every sneer from Richard, every complicit nod from Emma, and every dismissive word from Sarah, all were being silently flagged by Zenith's internal AI. A small piece of a larger puzzle, a corporate culture rotting from within. Maya stood still, seemingly alone, but her eyes had begun to scan, not for help, but to remember every face, every flinch, every carefully averted gaze. Outside, social media was surging like a tidal wave. She knew one voice can be silenced, but millions together cannot. At the back of the cabin, Ethan had just posted his second tweet. When he looked up, their eyes met. No words, just a small nod from him, the kind that said, "You're not alone." The air in the cabin was still heavy, like every molecule was holding back breath. But somewhere in that silence, a new energy had begun to rise, the kind born when the truth finally starts to surface. It had no name yet, but it was there. Maya hadn't moved. Her face was calm, still as glass, but behind her eyes, a current had begun to rise, a quiet, unshakable resolve. Sarah turned on her heel. Her shoes struck the carpet with stiff precision, like a glacier sliding across velvet. As she reached the cockpit door, she leaned toward her co-pilot, Tom Barker, a broad-shouldered man with a square jaw, and whispered, "I'm flagging her, obstruction of flight." Each word landed like a verdict from on high. Tom said nothing, just gave a slight nod, but in his eyes was complicity, the silence of a man too afraid to challenge the system, even when he knew it had already rotted from the inside. Sarah returned to the cabin. Her face remained the picture of professional calm, but her eyes burned with frustration. She picked up the intercom and spoke in a voice flat and emotionless. "We apologize for the delay. We are currently resolving a seating issue. Please remain patient." The announcement was crisp, smooth, perfectly rehearsed, but everyone in the cabin could feel it. Something was very wrong, and there was no doubt about who it was aimed at, Maya. At the rear of first class, Emma Walsh, the lead flight attendant, stood tall, polished like she was on display, her auburn hair pinned neatly, her uniform flawless. In her hands, the tablet looked less like a tool and more like a shield. One tap was all it took, and Maya was officially flagged as unauthorized. No ID check, no name verification, just a cold decision. And instantly, Zenith's internal system lit up. "Unauthorized passenger, recommend removal." That alert rocketed back to headquarters. There, in a high-security command room filled with glowing LED screens, Anna Patel was monitoring the flight feed in real time. When the alert flashed across the master display, she frowned. In that moment, a corporate earthquake began to rumble. Maya, now treated like a glitch in the system, was about to become the spark, not just for change, but for a reckoning. In front of Zenith's main command screen, Anna Patel leaned in. No hesitation. She rewound the cabin feed and cross-checked the boarding logs. Within less than 60 seconds, the truth was crystal clear. No verification process had taken place. Emma had erased Maya from the system as if she were never there, simply because she felt like it. Meanwhile, back on the plane, Richard White continued his pitiful performance. He slid his briefcase closer to himself, a calculated move, and quietly passed a folded slip of paper across the aisle. On it, a careless scroll. "Try flying budget next time." Richard's eyes gleamed, proud of his final strike. His crooked grin gave him away, not just pleased Maya was being pushed out, but convinced she'd never belonged there to begin with. "No need for insults. That note said it all. You don't belong. Not because of paperwork, but because of your skin, your plain clothes, your humble presence." Maya opened the note, read it, then folded it neatly. She looked straight at Richard, her eyes calm, steady, almost unnervingly so. She didn't say a word, but her gaze was enough to silence the cabin. Because now it wasn't just the people in this cabin watching, it's the world. Under the mask of policy and phony politeness, a wave of outrage was beginning to rise. From afar, Ethan Collins caught the moment. Maya, holding the note, her expression unshaken. He prepared his next tweet. "Mean stands even after being denied. Discrimination isn't just in policy, it's in the attitude." With each passing second, the tension thickened. No one believed this was a simple clerical error anymore. This was a moral crack, and the people who caused it had already exposed themselves through their arrogance, their coldness, and a system that quietly enabled it all. Maya said nothing, but her silence spoke louder than any accusation. Amid the fog of bias, she didn't need to shout. Her calm presence rang out like the first bell in a revolution. First-class air now felt dense as fog, every breath heavier than the last. This wasn't about logistics anymore. This was a public display of outdated power, where rules bent to protect the privilege of the few. Sarah, after her sterile announcement, didn't return to the cockpit. Instead, she strode directly toward Maya, flanked by Tom Barker and Emma Walsh. The three formed a triangle around her, no more whispers. Now they spoke loud enough for the whole cabin to hear, turning Maya into the center of a mid-air courtroom. Sarah crossed her arms, eyes sharp as a blade, voice dripping hostility. "We are requesting immediate verification of your identity." And in the very next moment, the woman they had deemed a situation was about to turn silence into a thunderclap across the industry. "We also require proof of your priority status and financial capacity." Immediately, Sarah's voice was glacial. Tom stepped forward, face tense like he was preparing to escort a criminal. "If you cannot provide confirmation, you will be removed from first class. There are no exceptions." Those words, dressed up as protocol, were arrows shot at Maya's dignity. They weren't about facts or verification, they were about existence. As if even the thinnest excuse was enough to erase her from a space they believed was theirs alone. They gave her no chance to speak, no effort to review her documents, just repeated demands for proof of wealth, as if first class wasn't for anyone outside a silent, unspoken elite. At that very moment, Emma Walsh, face blank as a machine, quietly typed into her tablet. No questions asked, no eye contact, just one tap. And Maya's passenger profile was marked disruptive, a label meant for emergencies, now weaponized against someone who simply didn't look the part. Every step Sarah took, every contemptuous glance she gave, every sterile mention of policy from Tom, and every cold tap of Emma's tablet, together they painted a portrait of a system built on exclusion, cloaked in the polished veneer of rules and procedure. Maya remained standing, encircled by a machine of prejudice operating with seamless efficiency. The curious stares, the half-smiles from other passengers, They weren't aimed at someone who had done wrong, but someone who simply didn't belong. To them, her skin color, her modest clothing, her absence of designer logos, that was enough to mark Maya as out of place. A few rows back, Richard White leaned toward an older gentleman, speaking just loud enough for Maya to hear. Thought this was a city bus or something? Zenith needs to rethink who it lets into first class. Every smug remark, every dismissive glance, this was no longer personal. It was the machinery of systemic exclusion in motion, where those clinging to old power believed they could decide who was worthy of respect. In the back of the cabin, Ethan continued recording. Then he updated his next post, a few simple lines that cut to the bone. Zenith flight crew demands financial proof from a black woman, flags her as disruptive, calls security. No ID check, this isn't protocol, it's prejudice. Like striking a match over dry leaves, the internet erupted. Major media outlets reached out immediately, demanding statements, because they knew this wasn't just a flight incident. It was a brutal reenactment of decades of discrimination playing out live in the 21st century, 30,000 feet in the air. And the most shocking part? It took only minutes for the truth to surface. But the wave of reckoning had already begun. Unstoppable now, in the dead silence of first class. Every glance, every breath had become part of an oncoming storm. A storm no one on the flight crew saw coming. They didn't realize the actions they thought they controlled were now fuel igniting the simmering fire of a broken system ready to collapse. Before tension could settle, a new figure entered, turning the pressure up another level. The cockpit door slid open to reveal Lucas Grant, head of security for Zenith Airlines. Tall, stern, dressed in a crisp black uniform, his expression frozen, unreadable. Each of his steps landed like a gavel on steel, sharp, deliberate, absolute. When he stopped beside Maya, he looked down at her with the bearing of someone long used to giving orders at cruising altitude. His voice sliced through the cabin like a blade. "Ma'am, please put away your device and vacate your seat. You've been flagged as unauthorized and disruptive." The sound was sucked out of the cabin. Tension, already boiling, now burst into open confrontation. Some passengers blinked in surprise. Others quickly looked away, afraid of being pulled into the scene. Still, no one spoke in Maya's defense. She remained seated, her hand resting lightly on her tablet, expression calm, untouched. When Lucas looked down at her, Maya gave the faintest smile, nearly imperceptible, but if one looked closely, they'd see the steel being forged behind it. Then, without warning, without a word, Lucas snatched the tablet from her hands. A sharp crack echoed through the air, shattering the fragile illusion of air-conditioned civility. The device hit the floor with a jarring thud, like a gunshot fired through the heart of the elevated service experience first class claimed to represent. A middle-aged woman gasped, clutching her purse tighter. A man behind her dropped his newspaper to the floor. The entire cabin froze. Even Richard White couldn't hide his surprise, but instead of outrage, his lips curled into a smile. A satisfied smile, because to him this was justice served, watching someone who didn't belong finally get put in their place. Behind Lucas, Sarah and Tom stood motionless, statues made of stone and silence. But the lack of protest said it all. Tiny nods of approval confirmed what words didn't need to. Emma Walsh, face blank and bloodless, typed another line into her tablet. Security intervention. Passenger non-compliant. No mention of violence, no record of the sudden, unnecessary physical aggression. Just a neat, soulless note, the system washing its hands. It all happened in seconds, but not a single frame escaped the lens of Ethan Collins. His hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. The camera kept rolling, capturing every beat. Then he uploaded the footage to X, formerly Twitter, with one short, gut-punching caption. Head of security assaults passenger. And this time the truth could no longer be buried. The post was just 3 words. Physical contact. Zenith failed. Racism. But it landed like a punch, straight to the gut of the system. The backlash was instantaneous. Thousands of comments, shares, and replies surged across platforms. Reporters, activists, lawyers, the online public, they flooded the thread, tagging government regulators and major media outlets. Industry titans were immediately pulled into the conversation. On board, the air began to shift. The passengers who had stayed quiet now whispered among themselves. Some pulled out their phones to record, no longer afraid of punishment from authorities. The complicity of silence shattered. That violent yank of the tablet wasn't just an insult. It became a symbol of abuse of power, of the moral failure of an entire industry, and of the spark that had finally ignited a public firestorm. Yet at the very center of it all, Maya did not move. She remained seated, spine straight, eyes locked on Lucas. In those eyes there was no fear, only a message, loud and clear. Go ahead. I'm not backing down. The sound of the shattered tablet still echoed in the cabin, but thousands of miles away, at Zenith's global headquarters in Chicago, something else was unfolding. Beneath the cold blue glow of her screen, Anna Patel, Maya's tech advisor, tracked the real-time system feed. And then she saw it. Seconds earlier, Emma Walsh had used elevated admin access to erase Maya's presence from the passenger manifest, then tagged her as unauthorized and disruptive. Inside the system, that single act rewrote the story. Suddenly, Maya's removal looked justified. Immediately, Anna initiated lockdown protocol, Zenith's top-tier security safeguard. From that moment forward, every move the crew made, every data edit was recorded, immutable and traceable. Zenith's internal AI began sweeping the flight's data logs. The results lit up with red flags, anomalies everywhere. An alert triggered automatically. Violation risk detected, potential discrimination and data manipulation. At the top floor of Zenith HQ, Elena Rivers, the company's general counsel, received the alert. A sharp-minded Latina attorney with zero tolerance for injustice. Without hesitation, she filed an urgent report with the Federal Aviation Administration. Then, through a discreet encrypted channel embedded in Mayer's smart ring, she connected. Elena's voice rang in Maya's ear, calm, precise, sharp as steel. Maya, do not leave your seat. All internal systems are secured. The whole world is watching. In that moment, Maya was no longer just a passenger wronged. She had become the eye of an awakening storm, the banner for every voice that had ever been silenced. But this power play was just beginning. Outside the cabin, the media storm had officially arrived. Ethan Collins's first tweet struck like a fire alarm. Within minutes, tech journalists, civil rights advocates, and legal analysts were broadcasting the story across the internet. Bloomberg headlines lit up across every platform. Black female CEO humiliated on her own private jet. Racism at 30,000 feet. Reuters followed immediately with a chilling title. Zenith Aerospace faces backlash after video shows passenger assaulted, discrimination alleged. And there she was, Maya. Petite, unflinching, surrounded by flight crew. The shattered tablet on the floor, her eyes locked on her accuser. The image became a symbol for millions now watching the live stream unfold in real time. The truth was spreading faster than Sarah, Emma, or anyone on that crew could have imagined. Up front, Sarah Miller glanced at Emma Walsh. The arrogance was gone. Now there was only unease. Sarah tried to maintain her composure, but her lips trembled. She noticed the passengers quietly recording. Tom Barker, once silent and complicit, now realized things had spiraled far beyond control. There was regret in his eyes, but not yet the courage to speak. Lucas Grant still stood like a statue next to Maya, but his confidence was cracking. All the phones pointed at him made him feel like he was already on trial, in the court of public opinion. On social media, hashtags like Justice for Maya and Xena Fail exploded into global trends within 4 minutes. Aviation leaders, human rights groups, major international press, all demanding answers, not statements, not spin. Accountability, a public end to hidden discrimination. Back at headquarters, Anna Patel expanded her oversight. She began auditing the full flight histories of Sarah, Emma, and Lucas. Irregular edits, deleted logs, the internal AI flagged it all. An unprecedented investigation was now underway. And at the center of it all, Maya stayed still. Though millions of eyes were now on her, Maya didn't choose outrage. She chose composure, a quiet force that could not be snuffed out. She understood this moment was no longer hers alone. It was a call for justice, for human dignity, in a sky long ruled by status and control. The air in first class was heavy, like glass on the verge of shattering. On one side, a whirlwind of injustice still swirling, on the other, a media storm howling louder by the second. And in the middle, a woman who didn't need to stand to make the entire system bow. One moment felt the beginning of a new era. In a sky where justice was finally learning how to fly, Maya sat in her seat, unmoving, eyes steady, glowing with quiet defiance. She didn't need to speak. Every breath she took now was a declaration. At the back of the cabin, Ethan Collins finished typing the final lines of the post he knew would rock the industry. His hands still shook with fury, but not a single word was misplaced. The photo, Maya, head held high, gaze like steel locked on Lucas Grant. Below her, the shattered tablet. Now it was more than an image. It was a truth that could no longer be hidden. His post hit X instantly. Confirmed. The woman discriminated against is Dr. Maya Johnson, CEO of Zenith Technologies. She owns this plane. Seconds later, passengers' phones lit up in unison, notifications flooding in. The post was going viral, spreading like wildfire. Then the true shock came. The large display screen at the front of the cabin, once showing flight info, suddenly changed. It switched channels and began live streaming a breaking Bloomberg report. The headline cut through the cabin like a blade. Tech billionaire racially profiled on her own jet. ChatGPT said. The air was sucked out of the room. A heavy, terrifying silence descended across the cabin. What began as curious glances had turned to confusion, and now disbelief, awe, and shame. Sarah Miller, once composed like a commander in full control, now looked as though the life had been drained from her. Her pride, her calm, crumbled into panic and disorientation. Her eyes darted from Maya to Tom to Emma, searching for a lifeline in a storm of her own making. Every action they had taken to brand Maya as unauthorized now stood as undeniable evidence of an unforgivable failure. Emma Walsh froze, her finger hovering mid-air over her tablet. The tags she'd applied, disruptive, unauthorized, now blazed like scars of complicity. She realized every tap she had been recorded, not just by Zenith's internal AI, but by millions watching around the world. Tom Barker, who had remained silent out of convenience, could no longer maintain his detached expression. His head lowered, sweat on his brow, lips twitching as if he might say something, but he didn't. Because by now he knew there was nothing left to say. And Richard White, once smug, legs crossed with self-assurance, sat frozen like a statue, no longer leaning back in power but gripping the armrests, his face pale and drained. The note he'd once passed, "Try flying economy next time," was now a weapon turned back on him, a brutal exposé of the darkness he thought he'd hidden behind charm and privilege. Around the cabin, passengers who had stayed silent began to stir. A woman raised her hand to her mouth, shocked by what she'd just witnessed. Others looked at Maya with changed eyes filled with respect, remorse, or a kind of quiet solidarity that had finally risen from somewhere honest. The cabin, once thick with tension and exclusion, had shifted. Now it felt like the beginning of an awakening, as though in mere minutes a curtain had fallen away, revealing not just a broken system but the people who had chosen to look away. And at the center of it all, Maya still hadn't spoken a word. But the entire world was listening. On dozens of phones, news feeds scrolled endlessly. Zenith's CEO, humiliated by her own flight crew, racial profiling at 30,000 feet, billionaire's resistance, justice delivered in the sky. Every headline pounded like a hammer against the polished glass of elite aviation until it cracked. Sarah stumbled backward, her face drained of color, her eyes spiraling like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. The pride was gone, only fear remained. Emma bit her lip, as if she were about to speak, but didn't. Any words now would be meaningless. Lucas Grant, once towering like a symbol of corporate authority, stood, jaw clenched, eyes avoiding Maya's. No apology, but in that silence a confession. And Maya still seated, upright, chin high. But the stillness now wasn't silence. It was power, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. She didn't have to argue. She was the living proof. Then came Elena Rivers's voice in Maya's earpiece. Measured, unwavering, absolute. Maya, global media has confirmed you are the owner of this flight. It's time. Speak. Justice is yours. The tables turned with a speed no one saw coming. Minutes ago, they tried to eject an outsider. Now that very woman had reclaimed the cabin without a single threat, only truth, and a name no one could deny. The old order was crumbling before their eyes. The air thickened again, not with fear, but with the gravity of truth. Sarah's stunned expression, Emma's quiet regret, Tom's solemn nod, Lucas's averted gaze. They were no longer in control, just debris of a collapsing system. The masks of order and civility had fallen, and those who once turned away were now forced to bear witness to the reckoning. Maya stood up, slowly, deliberately, a grand music, no spotlight, just a woman in unbranded clothes, radiating a confidence and dignity that needed no label. She faced Sarah, the last face of a crumbling authority, and locked eyes with the woman trembling in place. You just racially profiled the person who hired you in front of the entire world. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word struck like a bell, tolling in the heart of a fallen empire. The front row stopped breathing. Those who once sneered now leaned in, some lifting their phones to record the moment that would never be buried. A silent revolution, powered by an undeniable truth. And then, over the cabin intercom, a voice rang out, firm, unshakable. Any attempt to forcibly remove Dr. Johnson from her seat will be considered a severe legal violation and will trigger an immediate investigation. The legal department is monitoring this situation in real time. In that moment, a regime fell, not by force, but by a woman who simply dared to say, "I'm still here." The flight crew was ordered to comply immediately. Silence wrapped around first class like a final curtain. Only the sound of breath and scattered whispers from the back rows remained. Maya stood tall, her gaze steady, her voice unwavering, each word landing like the final verdict etched in steel. ChatGPT said, Captain Sarah Miller, First Officer Tom Barker, Lead Flight Attendant Emma Walsh, Chief of Security Lucas Grant. You are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Richard White, you are permanently banned from flying on any Zenith aircraft. It wasn't a retaliation. There was no shouting, no vengeance in the air. It was the sound of a chapter closing and a new standard being written. A world where those who once claimed the right to humiliate and exclude would finally face consequences, not just with their jobs, but with the dignity they had so easily discarded. Sarah clenched her fists, lips trembling, but she couldn't find a word to protest. Emma backed away, clutching her tablet like a lifeline caught in a whirlpool. Tom Barker lowered his head, shoulders sagging under the weight of regret and fear. And Lucas, the man who had ripped the tablet from Maya's hands, now stood still, eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. Richard White, once the face of smug privilege, was now the most isolated man in the cap. His cheap shot of a note, "Try flying economy," now lay heavy on his conscience, a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of himself. He sat quietly, gripping the seat, eyes vacant, as if he'd just been exiled from a world he thought he owned. And then the unthinkable happened. The passengers, those who had only watched until now, began to clap, not a thunderous ovation, but something soft, deliberate, and deeply human. They clapped for Maya, for everyone who had ever been quietly pushed out of the privileged section, for justice now finding its voice. In just 5 minutes, a system once thought untouchable had been brought to its knees, by a woman who simply stood her ground, by a network of technology, law, and truth finally tilting the scale toward what was right. The air was still thick, not just from the collapse of facades, but because for the first time everyone understood old power could no longer shield the truth. Maya sat upright. Then, slowly, She stood. The eyes that had once looked away now turned toward her, with respect and in some cases with fear. The wrinkled shirt, the scuffed shoes, no longer signs of an outsider. Now they were symbols, quiet but mighty, of courage and self-worth. The cabin fell completely silent. Each passenger now understood that behind every crew member's action was a system, unspoken and unchallenged. Until now, as the last clap faded, the front screen flickered to life. The Zenith internal command interface appeared. Anna Patel, head of technology, and Elena Rivers, general counsel, came into view. They didn't smile. They didn't soften the blow. What they were about to say wasn't about a single flight anymore. It was the opening chapter of a reckoning. Every word cut clean, precise, straight through the protective shell Zenith had once hidden behind. Anna Patel spoke first, her voice low, steady, and firm. Following an internal audit and AI-based analysis, Zenith confirms the discovery of multiple serious violations. Then Elena looked straight into the camera, unblinking. There would be no interruption. We have verified that Captain Sarah Miller has received over 20 formal complaints for discriminatory behavior in the past 3 years, primarily from female and minority passengers. She paused, just long enough for the words to land, then continued. First Officer Tom Barker was not only aware of these complaints, he actively modified, delayed, or suppressed them. They were never escalated to senior management or external agencies. The cabin screen flashed again. Flight logs, timestamps, redacted reports, some completely erased, others visibly altered. And below each, Tom Barker's signature with a single note. No issue found. Anna picked up the thread, voice still calm, controlled. Lead flight attendant Emma Walsh repeatedly altered passenger records, specifically those of women and passengers of color, resulting in their downgrades, revoked privileges, or being labeled unauthorized without proper cause. The screen filled with data, edit trails, names, dates, changes, all exposed. Every keystroke laid bare before millions now watching the live broadcast. And then Elena turned to Lucas Grant. Her tone sharpened to steel. Chief of Security Lucas Grant used unauthorized force on a passenger, specifically Zenith Technologies CEO Maya Johnson. This was not a loss of control. It was a blatant abuse of power with racial implications. All supporting evidence, video footage, logs, transcripts was forwarded in real time to both the Federal Aviation Administration and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Simultaneously, those same videos played on the cabin screen so every passenger could see it for themselves. On every phone, breaking banners crawled across the news feeds. Zenith submits violation files to federal agencies. FAA and EEOC launch racial and gender bias investigation into commercial aviation. Sarah slumped into her seat, her face ghost white. Emma backed into a corner, eyes dazed. Tom gripped the edge of a table, lips pressed together in silent shame. Lucas, once the face of power, now looked carved from stone. No one spoke. There was nothing left to deny. The truth, at last, had spoken with the full weight of justice. And this time it didn't need permission. Emma stood frozen, eyes red, hands trembling so violently she could barely hold the tablet. Lucas lowered his head, his shoulders slumped, as if crushed by the weight of a structure he helped build. And in that same first-class cabin, once a stage for exclusion, the woman they tried to erase, Maya, now stood tall, a monument to unshakable dignity. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need anger. Her silence in the face of their exposed actions had brought an entire system to its knees. Whispers began to rise among the passengers. Some teared up. Others nodded slowly, as if witnessing something sacred. No one questioned it anymore. This wasn't just the triumph of one woman. It was liberation for everyone who'd ever been buried beneath prejudice and silence. At Zenith headquarters, Anna Patel and Elena Rivers issued a formal announcement. All internal accounts of those involved have been locked. Zenith pledges full cooperation with federal authorities and is launching a sweeping overhaul focused on transparency, equity, and anti-discrimination across the organization. One by one, The masks that had once protected the old guard were torn away. Every data entry now stood as undeniable testimony, and from this moment on, the airline industry would never be the same. Inside the cabin, the weight of truth still hung heavy, but outside that Gulfstream G650, the world was roaring. Within minutes, social media exploded into a digital firestorm. Hashtags like Justice for Maya, Zenith Fail, and End Aviation Bias swept across Instagram, X, and Facebook. Millions of shares, comments, and fierce debate over equality and justice. Major outlets, CNN, Bloomberg, Reuters, the New York Times, deployed correspondents to cover the story live. Every tweet from Ethan Collins became a breaking headline, shaking the aviation and corporate world to its core. Passengers' phones buzzed with headline after headline. Zenith CEO humiliated on her own jet. Operation Probe, FA, launches emergency discrimination probe. Hundreds of partners suspend deals with Zenith. Right there in the sky, the fusion of technology and collective voice had shattered the walls of silence. The same passengers who once looked away now recorded, posted, and offered support. Some quietly wiped their eyes. A middle-aged white woman, her voice shaking, whispered, "I've never seen justice feel this close." "I'm sorry I stayed silent." A young Latino man reached for Maya's hand, his eyes misted. "You gave me hope. For my mother, for my sister, for all of us." Those who had sneered, who once rolled their eyes at Maya's entry into first class, now bowed their heads in quiet reckoning. No one needed to accuse them. The stares around them rendered the verdict. At Zenith HQ, Anna and Elena continued working around the clock, auditing flight logs, AI flags, and suppressed reports. Layer by layer, surfacing every quiet act of discrimination that had once been buried. The Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency directive. All flight crew records must be preserved for investigation. Zenith was ordered to collaborate with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to conduct a full review of its race, gender, and personnel policies. The backlash wasn't just personal anymore. It now consumed Zenith itself, its leadership, its strategic partners, and the broader American aviation industry. At major airports, crowds gathered. Journalists, attorneys, activists, and people who had once endured the same treatment. They were ready to witness a historic confrontation, one between justice and the old order. Back on the plane, Maya never wavered. In the heart of an emotional storm, she was no longer just a passenger. She was now a symbol, the face of a historic awakening. One by one, the passengers stood, clapping. Some wept. Some rested their hands on her shoulder, whispering thank you like a personal confession. Ethan Collins, once just a freelance content creator, had become a voice for the movement. He live-streamed the moment Maya was officially recognized, bringing history into every home, every pocket, every screen in America. This was no longer her story alone. It had become a reckoning, shaking the entire industry. Competing airlines scrambled to respond, announcing reforms, launching anti-bias hotlines, and pledging transparency. Social justice leaders began invoking Maya Johnson by name, not just as a survivor, but as the beginning of a new era of fairness in the skies. Inside the cabin, every handshake, every nod of respect, every round of applause was a hymn to justice. Proof that in just 5 minutes, one woman's resolve had shattered the silence and forced a system to change. As public pressure reached its peak, the first official decision was issued at lightning speed. From the FAA's headquarters, a broadcast lit up every screen, phones, TVs, and even the main monitor on the Gulfstream G650, where Maya still stood, calm, resolute, at the eye of the storm. In the silence of first class, heavy with emotion, Maya stood tall. Her voice was low, steady, unwavering. She didn't call for personal punishments. She didn't name names. Instead, she looked forward, toward a future where dignity and fairness would define a once exclusive industry. Maya raised her wrist and activated the live stream from her smartwatch. The cabin screen immediately synced with Zenith HQ, and the millions still watching around the world. A new logo appeared, Zenith Equity Program, a symbol for the reform era now born. Starting now, Maya declared, her voice clear, unshaken. We are officially launching an AI-powered equity monitoring system. Every act of bias or data manipulation across all Zenith flights and departments will be recorded, analyzed, and secured through immutable technology. ChatGPT. The applause rose like a wave. Some passengers couldn't hold back tears. This wasn't just a promise. It was a vow, a living testament that justice would no longer be hidden in the dark. Meyer continued, we are also launching the Zenith Fund with an initial investment of $30 million. This fund will support scholarships, training, mentorship, and career opportunities for women, people of color, and historically marginalized communities. We commit to this. The skies must be open to everyone regardless of background, skin color, gender, or circumstance. A quiet awe rippled through the cabin. It felt like witnessing an irreversible moment in aviation history. Marcus Jordan, a young black entrepreneur who had silently observed, was personally invited by Maya to join the Zenith Equity Advisory Council. Ethan Collins, who had dared to capture the truth in its rawest form, was named the company's first strategic inspiration advisor, with full voice in every executive boardroom. Online, the momentum exploded. Former pilot, posting his @Skyer story, shared a post that stunned millions. I've stayed silent for decades, terrified of losing my job as a woman of color in a field dominated by white men. Today, Maya Johnson gave me the courage to speak. Thank you, Maya, not just for standing for yourself, but for all of us. Within hours, thousands of personal stories flooded the web of discrimination, stalled careers, and the silence people were forced to carry. In the cabin, passengers passed the news from hand to hand. Many volunteered for Zenith's equity program not as customers, but as independent auditors, community advisors, and mentors for the next generation. A quiet revolution born from 5 minutes of what once felt like helplessness had grown into a wave reshaping an entire industry. But the most important changes were still ahead. Those who had once shrunk beneath power now stepped into the light, building a new standard for aviation. At Zenith HQ, Anna Patel and Elena Rivers wiped tears from their cheeks as they and their teams in AI, audit, and legal finalized their first report to the FAA and the media. It wasn't just an update, it was a roadmap for reforming every process, every flight, every quiet moment that had once gone unchecked. Maya's legacy was no longer about victory in a cabin. It was about igniting a national movement for equity in the skies, about restoring hope for everyone who had ever endured injustice in silence. Her eyes now held a quiet joy. Outside the plane window, the sky felt wider than ever. The last light of day cast a golden glow across the fuselage, like a blessing from a new era. From this day forward, dignity is our wing, and justice will no longer be silenced. The sun dipped low, slanting through the cabin windows, lighting every face with a soft brilliance. No one spoke, but it wasn't the silence of fear or apathy. It was the hush of gratitude, of reflection, of reverence for human worth and moral courage. And then, as if guided by some invisible signal, the entire cabin rose. The applause wasn't loud or dramatic. It was steady, purposeful, a quiet affirmation of what was right and unstoppable. An elderly woman turned to her seatmate and whispered, "Thank you, Maya. Today you made me believe things really can change." Maya Johnson bent to pick up her tablet. She didn't look back at the eyes once filled with doubt. She simply straightened her plain shirt and walked forward. She didn't leave that aircraft as someone who had been humiliated, or as a victim of a broken system, and she stepped off as a symbol of transformation, the woman who had made the aviation industry take flight again, this time on the wings of justice. At the bottom of the aircraft's stairs, a crowd waited. Journalists, airline employees, passengers, all had followed her story on their screens. No one asked her about her net worth or job title. They only wanted to know one thing. Where did you find the strength not to back down? At Zenith's HQ, the inbox flooded with thank you notes, heartfelt confessions and self-recorded testimonies. Women pilots, engineers, technicians, once sidelined, were finally telling their real stories. The wounds they had hidden, the quiet battles they had fought. Across media, big and small, the image of Maya standing tall in the first-class cabin, eyes unblinking, defiant, became the image of the year. Hashtag 5 Minutes for Justice spread like wildfire. Thousands of businesses, schools, local governments across the U.S. began hosting real conversations on equity, not just to listen, but to right wrongs and rebuild. And just like that, from 5 tense minutes on one first-class flight, a new era took off. No one would be left behind again, and no power would ever be allowed to hide behind silence. And the name of the woman who led the way was Maya Johnson. In just one day, 5 brief minutes, a new chapter was written, not just for one airline, but for an entire generation that longed for fairness and truth. That evening, at a packed press conference, a reporter asked, "Miss Johnson, what message do you want to leave with the world?" Maya didn't raise her voice. She simply smiled and drew from her own experience. Justice doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just needs 5 minutes. And one woman who refuses to be erased. The quote spread beyond the press room. It became a banner in classrooms, a mural in office spaces, a rallying cry at equity summits, was memorized by a new generation, especially those who had once been cast aside for their skin, their gender, their circumstances, or their name. From that day on, every Zenith flight began with a promise. Echoed over the cabin intercom, "We commit to protecting the dignity and equality of every passenger." Because history had made one thing clear, sometimes all it takes is 5 minutes, and one person willing to rise to change everything. The skies were no longer the domain of privilege. They had opened for all. This is where the story ends, but it's also where the real journey begins. If you've ever been wounded by injustice, kept quiet when you should have spoken, or wished someone would stand for what's right, remember this. You might be the next Maya in someone's story. One person, 5 minutes, one bold choice. That's all it takes to shake the world. If this story stirred something in you, leave a comment. Even one sentence might give someone out there the courage they need. And if you believe truth deserves to be seen, share this video, follow for more. Together, we'll keep writing the stories that build a more just, more human world. Thank you for listening.